Hello, it's this again, except this is actually a YouTube video and I don't actually make these very often, so this is something completely different, actually. Never mind. Anyway, today I wish to talk to you for an indeterminate amount of time about speedrunning and esports. Now, you may or may not be familiar, probably not, with a couple of articles that I wrote on these very topics, one in 2018 and the other in early 2019, so about a year ago and 2 years ago, respectively. This video will mostly be rehashing the second one, because it's the most relevant. The first article concerns tournament structure, whereas the second one actually concerns the community ethics involved with that. So if you prefer to just read the article, there is a link in the description, you can do that. The only thing I'm really going to be changing about that article is the tense, because I wrote that article in the past, and for the most part, I was pretty spot on about a lot of things, so I don't have to change very much about it, other than just the tense in which I read it. You may be wondering, oh, why are you rehashing something you wrote like a year ago in video format? And the answer is because it's easier to get people to listen to my voice than it is to get them to read words on a screen. So that's where we're at with this. So I'm going to make the bold assumption that you already know what speedrunning is and what speedrun tournaments are. You beat the games faster than other people until the end of the tournament where you then get money. And I'd say like the genesis of these bigger prize pool speedrun tournaments was GSA's Celeste League that started in January of 2019, where they guaranteed a developer-backed $5,000 prize pool, which is interesting. And for the record, I am not of the opinion that more money in speedrunning is inherently a bad thing, but just that this format in which it is being injected into the scene has problems. Proponents of this type of thing would like you to believe that there is no problem and it's objectively a good thing and there are no pitfalls whatsoever. Those people are either naive, stupid, or intentionally misleading you to further their grift. So the most basic criticism that can be leveled at this is that the possibility of being paid for putting time into something inherently changes how that activity plays out. This is just a fact. It's a pretty fundamental fact of any type of hobby, really. Fucking Etsy changed arts and craft, streaming getting bigger changed the very landscape of playing video games as a hobby. It changed the industry at large. There is no circumstance under which cash influx into a subculture as a result of certain patterns in that subculture do not change it. There is, again, anyone positing that that's not true is a liar. It's a very time-proven thing. And speedrunning is no different if you've not been paying any attention. Speedrunning was a pretty niche hobby for a while, where people actually physically mailed VHS tapes around to get proof of their runs onto Speed Demo's archive. But streaming really, kickstarted speedrunning into being its own thing, and now it's seen explosive growth in popularity. The user count on speedrun.com has skyrocketed in the last couple of years. It's insane. And for my part, I'm a benefactor of this. I stream speedruns on Twitch and I make money off it now, and I would be hard-pressed to describe this situation as being worse than it was in the olden days where very few people cared and there was basically no career in this whatsoever, or even just a side hustle, really. But the point isn't to argue whether or not that change is good or bad. The point is just to demonstrate that money has definitively changed the landscape of speedrunning already. And it's pretty clear from organizations like Speed Gaming and GSA putting on tournaments for games like Celeste and Link to the Past Randomizer with large prize pools that people really want this to be a thing. They want the brand sponsorships and the flashy presentation of something like the fighting game community's current way of doing things, and why not? That's all fun and games, right? And while I personally am not convinced this isn't just a giant bubble, nevertheless, speedrunning has certain complexities compared to more traditional competitive games that need to be dealt with in order to seriously examine how viable this is as a cohesive esport. And currently these are questions that no one is actually asking themselves before going ahead and doing stuff like this. They're just charging ahead because they got dollar signs in their eyes. But for the purposes of posing these questions, I'm going to examine the value shifts that have taken place in the community or are taking place since these types of tournaments have become more mainstream. So first, a dichotomy for you. Currently, in order to make any appreciable amount of income off of speedrunning, you need to stream your game, and you need to have a stream that performs quite well. In order to do that, you have to be generally charming and funny and likable enough so that people actually want to watch you play a video game for 12 hours in a row. This is quite difficult to do, especially given success on Twitch is quite random at the best of times. But note in that the thing that people make money off of when they do this is not the quality of their speedruns, it's the stream. That being said, people who can make a career out of streaming do tend to perform better speedruns than others because they have more time and financial support to practice their runs, naturally. So they'll have that advantage in terms of sheer playtime, if nothing else, but it's not guaranteed that a popular streamer produces good speedruns. It's just a lot more likely. Now, a paid prize pool would change that almost immediately, since getting a payout would ride on your immediate ability in that given speedrun, rather than your ability to please an audience while streaming those speedruns. And that can be a good thing, because there are some kinds of people who just simply cannot engage with streaming as a form of income in a reliable fashion. People who are shy, people who don't speak English very well. Streaming is notoriously English-heavy. But in theory, people like that could simply place well in events instead and receive payouts in that fashion. This dichotomy already exists in fighting games. There are popular fighting game streamers with completely non-existent tournament results, and plenty of noteworthy killers in the tournament scene who do not stream at all. And this can loop back on itself, since a strong tournament performance can also bolster the notoriety of a player and feed back into their streaming endeavours, giving them a chance to break into that industry as well. It has more avenues for participants to accrue a following and financial support for their effort, in theory. Now, that's how it works for fighting games, but speedruns are crucially different in one important regard. There's no interaction between the players. Your strategy in a speedrun does not change regardless of what the other person does. It's very unlikely you'd even have time to process what the other player's doing in the middle of your run, so you have no chance to even really interact on that level. Whereas to become a tournament-winning player in any other, directly competitive video game, you'd have to face off against other tournament-quality players, travel around to various events, possibly even internationally to do it. You can grind online as much as you like, but eventually you're gonna have to get tournament experience to win tournaments. And this is just not true of speedrunning. The solo grind is really all there is in speedrunning. There's no events to travel to, no tournament techniques that's distinct, no human opponents or metagames to practice against. All you need is yourself and a game. And this has indeed been borne out at one of the tournaments that I mentioned earlier in this very video, the Celeste GSA tournament, where the finals did in fact play out between the people who comprised the top 4 of the leaderboard already. What a surprise. This solitary nature is one of the reasons the barrier to entry to speedrunning is so low, but the end result of this is that it ends up biasing tournaments with a payout even harder towards those people who are already in a position to stream long hours grinding a single game's run. And indeed, surprising no one, the person who won the very first GSA Celeste League was TGH, who is a career streamer. He streams full-time, and spent the majority of his full-time playing Celeste. I think he won the second league as well, because he's the only full-time streamer who reliably runs Celeste. And for what it's worth, I don't have beef with the guy or anything, but his involvement in this is quite illustrative, because it's a great example of how this type of tournament does just kind of feed money into the select few people who are already in a position to take advantage of it. This creates a kind of snowballing rich-get-richer effect that's endemic to the way stream growth in general works in this industry. And other competitive games also have things like this. You need people who are willing to dump a large amount of their time in order to get good at something, but other competitive games emphasize events and generally require experience against human players more often, which does not tend to go hand in hand with streaming constantly. So the effect is still somewhat present, but speedrunning's solitary nature exacerbates it dramatically. And this is still getting ahead of myself a bit, because in order to have a tournament, you need players, I think. And what better way do you get players than by choosing what games are already popular? And that has been the prominent issue with almost all forms of this since it's become like a thing, is that the only games that really get speedrun tournaments with payouts are the games that have large player bases already. They're the games in the top 5 of the most ran active games on speedrun.com's page already, your Marios, your Pokemon, I think Resident Evil 2 Remake is fairly up there as well. That got a Twitch Rivals once. It's the rich get richer effect in force once more. And really, speedrunning's been trending this way for a long time, ever since viewers became a prominent concern to people within the scene. 1% of the games has 99% of the audience share, pretty much. And naturally, there are upsides and downsides to this. The most obvious negative is that it further erodes a sense of diversity in the scene and creates further difficulty to games that can't organize prize pools to attract new runners. This is more or less already the case. Trying to create a new speedrun community from scratch in an environment where most people only care about the already established things is very difficult, but that's a tale as old as art itself. It's not really unique to speedrunning. However, the flip side of this is that because I believe this whole esports thing to mostly be a bubble, it really only affects the top 5 games, so it's very unlikely that this will eclipse the main way of doing runs. Because most games can't afford to run tournaments, nor do they have the player share to do so. So the current way of life, as it were, isn't really going anywhere, although it could make certain breakout successes in the scene, like, say, Battle for Bikini Bottom, rarer, because it adds less incentive to try and create that scene from whole cloth. And well, that all sounds well and good, right? If it's only the top 10 games in the scene that can afford to have tournaments with large prize pools, and everyone else just goes about their business as normal, what's the problem? Well, where do you think the money is coming from, for one thing, right? This is a community-founded effort. We don't have sponsors, for the most part. They haven't really taken an interest in the scene yet, so community-funded tournaments are community-funded. It comes from us. The money comes from the people. And events like GSA, especially GSA, have got a pretty good grift going on with abusing the shit out of community goodwill in order to fund events that they themselves don't really have the cash to put on, in order to funnel that money back into the top 1% of runners who are poised to take advantage of it. So we are paying them to make themselves more money. And they often do this in the form of, like, the pseudo-charity fundraiser format, but it's, like, for the event. Or, like, runner travel fees to go to live events like Pace. That was a whole thing where one of the final competitors was Flat, and he's from Brazil, and he had to pay his own way there, which was community funded, so, you know, fantastic. At present, the money just isn't there organically, so it comes from us. So again, we are paying their bills for them to run these events, and then they're just giving it to the people who are already in the position of generally making quite a lot of money off of the video games anyway. It's a pretty sweet grift, actually, when you break it down. But it's very hard to look at events like Pace and say that this is an event with much competitive rigor behind it. What it essentially is self-serving nonsense funded by us, and I don't know why people go for it. This is not esports. This is not the future of speedrunning. This is a bubble that's due to burst as soon as people realize how badly they're being screwed. And it's like, alright then, let's try another way. What if we get the money from sponsors instead? What if we get it from developers, like the fighting game community tends to do? Publishers tend to fund fighting game tournaments themselves. Well, firstly, if you think the FGC is perfect in this regard, then you're not a member of the FGC. And secondly, that runs into unique issues with speedrunning because developer intention and community values are at pretty strong odds with each other in speedrunning in particular. In fighting games, they're closer together. Not perfect, but they're closer together. Whereas in speedrunning, they are almost entirely diametrically opposed to each other. Speedrunners don't like patches very much. Patches that remove techniques that people have come to rely on and enjoy even. Playing outside the bounds of what is considered fair or within the scope of intention is, like, entirely the point of the subculture. And developer involvement in funding these tournaments puts it in a dangerous place because now they have active financial skin in how healthy their speed game is to run and how healthy, try to imagine me doing air quotes when I say that word, by the way, healthy a speed game is conceptually nonsense because it will never mean the same thing to two different people. It'll never mean the same thing to the community as it does to the developers. That's ridiculous. That'll never happen. So getting developer money involved, if they can even afford it in the first place or are willing to, is a gamble. And it's a gamble I would give serious thought to before you're willing to take it on. It's a gamble that I have lost many times in the past interacting with developers on other speedrun communities. Developers are not all the same. They are in fact not all cool people who really do get the spirit of speedrunning. Some of them are dicks. It happens. And if you get money involved, I reckon a lot of them will turn out to be more dickish than you might expect. That's a bit of a harsh take, I recognize, and possibly a bit confrontational, which is a bit awkward actually, because I'm, good friends with a bunch of indie devs who I really hope don't take this the wrong way. You guys are cool, right? But yeah, that's a problem. It can be a risk. And tournament rules kind of go against the entire speedrunning community ethos of open season on glitches and abusing everything to their maximum potential, because no two runners can even agree on what a glitch even means, which is why our usual way of doing things is just to declare open season on everything and have it in an any percent category, because we, as a community, are incredibly good at semantic bickering. See this entire video, for instance. So if you've ever seen speedrunners argue about categories before, can you imagine how shit these arguments would be if there were thousands of dollars on the line riding on what an opinion about a certain technique would be? And you might think this is a crazy hypothetical, like, no, this would never happen. Except it already has. It has happened before. There was a glitch in Celeste that proved somewhat unpopular with the community at large. It was called menu storage. It got patched out of the game and is no longer seen in runs, despite it being objectively the fastest way to do that particular segment. And it was patched out in large part because the GSA tournament happened to be live at the same time as that trick was discovered and was being explored. The developers and the community at large would probably deny that that was the reason, and I would say they're being disingenuous, because it totally came up in discussions about it. So it might not have been the reason, but it was a reason, and a reason can be enough to tip the scales. So we already have an example test case of a glitch that ordinarily would probably have flown without any future problems, being straight up removed from a speed game permanently because there was a tournament with money on the line, which seems quite funny now because no one cares anymore, so there's just a trick that's dead to history, and the context of that has mostly been lost. So that's good. Thank you very much for that. If I sound like I'm still bitter about it, that's because I am. So to further this point, consider a hypothetical as outlandish as you might find this on face value. Say Nintendo takes an interest in speedrunning and begins funding events. You might think that's unlikely, but consider how they're likely to feel about mods and ROM hacks of their games that have proven quite popular for speedrunning. Things like Link to the Past Randomizer. I don't get the feeling they'd be very happy with those sorts of things, because they haven't been happy with, in the past, a modification to Super Smash Bros. Brawl, known as Project M. Which, if you don't know what Project M is, Project M was a mod of Brawl created to make the game faster and more appealing to the competitive audience that generally preferred Smash Melee. Created in response to the fact that Brawl as a competitive game is bluntly shit. So it enjoyed some popularity in the Smash scene for a time, and was in active development, and then Nintendo started taking an interest in the competitive scene. They started actively supporting tournaments, and while they never actually directly issued any legal threats over it, they publicly disapproved of the mod. And their, money and influence led tournaments to pull the game from the lineup, and streams for the mod to not be broadcast, and the pressure eventually led to the team deciding to cease development on Project M altogether. As an aside, on the Miiverse forum, when that was still around, you would get an automatic ban if you mentioned Project M because they considered it, quote, criminal content. That's irrelevant, I just think that's funny. And while Project M isn't entirely dead, people do still play the game and run tournaments, but that type of pressure did stunt the scene quite unnaturally and prevent it from ever attaining much foothold. By the same token, Randomizer and other such ROM hacks would run a similar risk, where they're gambling on the goodwill of the license holder if they ever want to get involved. And that's a real risk, because that's a gamble you'll probably lose. And it might seem crazy that Nintendo would take an interest in speedrunning tournaments, but they only really took an interest in sponsoring fighting game tournaments relatively recently compared to other publishers, and that was considered a shocking turnaround from them, given that previously they were anywhere from ignorant to actively hostile towards competitive Smash play. Project M is a story that illustrates that such things absolutely can and do happen. They are not just conjecture. And that should be of particular interest to speedrunning, given that Link to the Past Randomizer is among one of the more developed tournament scenes inside of the subculture. In fact, Randomizer really only exists as a tournament game. So if Nintendo came knocking on the door, that whole scene would probably just die overnight. It wouldn't really have anywhere else to go. No one does, solo Randomizer runs except as, a knockabout on their streams or whatever. You wouldn't have much of a market left. So let's jump off corporate ethics for now and go to community ethics and talk about the thing that is so popular to talk about these days, cheating, because that's a problem with these. And we'll start with a behavior that's not actually considered cheating, but is more so just considered against the spirit of the subculture. Hiding your strategies, concealing knowledge from other players, maliciously or otherwise. This type of thing will generally net you some strong words from other people within your particular subcommunity, since speedrunning is collectively collaborative, and generally quite nomadic as well, actually. But we expect strategies to be shared, and most runners are more than willing to help newer players with the nuances of their game if they ask, since speedrunning is just a bunch of dorks who really like video games, and dorks like to just talk about their games to people who show an interest. That's a great strength of our community. If you're willing to converse with people who also know what they're talking about, you can learn a lot pretty quickly. No one's really that cagey. But, naturally, tournaments with big cash prizes strongly disincentivize players from being so eager to spill their secrets and so eager to teach people how to be as good as they are. In a tough tournament, if you conceal a discovery until the right moment, that could very well be the thing that clinches the win for you. And knowledge is one of the only ways you can really gain a concrete advantage over another player in this particular hobby, because there's no direct interaction between players, obviously. I guarantee you that that becomes more frequent if prize tournament frequency goes up as well. Because if you thought you can make more money by hiding a critical strategy until the right moment, you'd do it. I'd do it, and all it takes is one person, and everyone starts doing it. And there's precedent for this in other competitive scenes. Going back to fighting games one more time, there is a match between Armada and Hungrybox at Pound 5 in 2011, where Armada busted out his secret counterpick, Young Link, in order to counter his Jigglypuff, because Jigglypuff was quite a prominent character at that time, and has continued to be, actually. I have to use an example from Smash because that's the only fighting game anyone knows. I can't talk about Infiltration, so I can't because no one will know what I'm talking about. But anyway, Armada deliberately obfuscated his development of this strategy by specifically requesting that his training sets of Young Link not be recorded when he was practicing in Europe to continue developing that technique in secret, so that he blindsided the competition with it when it truly mattered. And that's fighting game community values for you, because that wasn't considered a scummy or dishonest tactic by Armada. By contrast, it was considered very exciting and is a memorable moment in that game's competitive scene. The crowd was cheering for him. They were going nuts for it. They loved him. And yes, some of that is just because they don't like Jigglypuff. But anyway, if someone did something like that in speedrunning, we'd crucify them for it. If you hid something until the relevant moment, you'd get your ass kicked over it, because there's really nothing you can do about it in a speedrunning format. In a fighting game like Smash Brothers, players have to square off against each other, head to head. You can adapt to new strategies. People have come out on top after adapting to an unconventional strategy, despite the fact it put them on the back foot. In a speedrun, you can't do that. You can't on the fly develop a new technique that saves you time if someone else was keeping something in the back pocket. It's very likely you won't even know what you lost to until the match is already over. And well, that's a matter of perspective, right? Because you could make the argument that a new strategy being pulled out in a speed game that's considered very optimized could be very exciting to be viewed live. I doubt the other player would see it quite like that, though. And I get the feeling the other viewers might not also take that kindly to it. I don't think that'd wash very well with everyone watching. Some people are there to, watch a match among equals, and if one person clearly has an advantage because they kept something in secret, that'd probably annoy some people. And of course, because speedrunning has that culture of abusing everything to its maximum potential, you can't have a kind of restriction that prevents people from doing something like that. In other competitive tournaments, like, say, Counter-Strike Global Offensive, they do have rules that govern the use of sort of glitchy and unfair tactics. So it's left to a judgment call, essentially. You can't do that in speedrunning, because there are no judgment calls as a default of how the hobby works. You can't have a rule that's like, no glitches that people don't already know about. That's preposterous. That's not discreet. That's not enforceable. And you'd get into all sorts of arguments about it, especially if there's money on the line. You can't do that. There would be no possible way to prevent people from keeping their cards close to their chest until the critical moment where it can completely change the match for them. And that goes against speedrunning's shared cultural ethos. We like to share our techniques, we like to share our strategies, but that's not the optimal strategy to win money in prize money tournaments. You'll have to keep your stuff secret if you think it can push the edge for you. And that is a change that I would like you to give sincere thought to when deciding whether or not this is the route you really want to go. And if you think people wouldn't do that because speedrunners are inherently just, one big happy family and they love each other and garbage like that, you're stupid, man. You really don't get it at all. And that is to say nothing of the people who might just attempt to cheat outright, just actual cheating. Cheating in speedrunning is a concern of limited importance at the moment, given that our current arrangement largely functions on the honor system. We have run verification, sure, but in order to prompt an investigation, you have to actually arouse suspicion first. Lots of runs with splices or other cheats have gone undetected for literal years because nobody really thought to look into it all that closely. And that's not anyone's fault, nor do I actually think that matters very much at the moment, in stark contrast to some other dipshits. Because for the most part, this is kept in check by the fact that having a world record doesn't actually possess a whole lot of inherent value, despite what most people would have you believe. It's not as though getting a world record in a game, even a popular one, immediately bestows a bunch of riches and fame and big-titted women on you. That's just not how it works. People have to actually care about you as a player, which means building your audience via a stream, which means you'd have to perform well and stream runs regularly and hours of attempts to improve. That cycle is the natural cycle that builds trust in a player and grows their stream. Cheating doesn't really figure into that very often. It's a shortcut to the result with none of the benefit. You don't really get that much out of it. People still do it sometimes, don't get me wrong, but figuring out how to actually get a material benefit out of cheating tends to be more difficult than just getting good at the game. I can think of one person who's ever pulled this grift off successfully, and honestly, they're very interesting, and that's sort of orthogonal to my point. Point is, it basically doesn't happen. The incidences of this happening are near zero. And tournaments with a cash prize immediately change that by granting an immediate reward to people who try and pull a fast one. And it's a lot easier to cheat at speedrunning than it is to cheat at other competitive games due to the decentralized and not directly competitive nature of it. And again, this happens. This has happened. We have Link to the Past Randomizer to thank for this yet again, because they were one of the first speedrun communities, speedrun adjacent, I suppose, really, but whatever. Point is, they were one of the first communities to start offering cash prizes for their tournaments, because they were pioneers in this regard. And they're also among the tournament scenes with the most well-documented instances of cheating. This is probably not a coincidence. Although some of these attempts at cheating are just amazing. I love the guy who got his wife to play the same random seed alongside him and tell him where the items were in different locations. That's just... oh, that's great. I love that one. That's my favorite. But anyway, there have been less funny instances of cheating, where people have just written programs to scrub the ROM for item locations ahead of time, which required the randomizer developers to create a counterfix to do that. If you start offering cash prizes for this sort of thing, there are some people who will start finding as many ways as they can to gain the edge. If you put a direct cash prize on that sort of thing, people will see it as a shortcut. And because speedrunning doesn't have a sort of central authority, and the idea of a central authority in speedrunning would probably be harshly rejected by the speedrunning community at large, if someone does something like that and gets kicked out of one community, there's not that much preventing them from floating back in on another, which is one of the very, very few things I would actually agree with Apollo Legend about. That sucks and is a problem. And all of that calls into question how viable esports even is for speedrunning in general, because it doesn't take too many instances of that happening before a lack of integrity incurs a collective feeling of no confidence and the entire thing just collapses in on itself. And there's only really so much you can do to combat this type of thing, short of just having people play live, and that's rife with its own issues. It's not practical due to the way the community is laid out. It's only practical if you do what GSA did and just abuse community goodwill to fund the tournament competitors' flight fees and accommodation, stupid shit like that. And well, that's the summation of everything that is a problem with current speedrunning tournaments, right? The thing is that everything I just said applies to tournaments, tournaments with a bracket, where you advance through stages by defeating opponents in Mortal Kombat. Everything I just said is completely meaningless in the face of this new wave of quote-unquote esports, with events like ESA Break the Record Live, where 6 people, I don't remember the actual number because I don't care, I think it's 6 runners essentially go to one place and compete to try and break the world record in their game live with a guaranteed prize pool of whatever. Let me be clear about something. This is not esports. This is not competitively rigorous. This is a smaller scale version of the pace grift, where it's essentially just the top 1% of speedrunners having more money funneled into them via the community. It's a small scale dumb grift. It is not the future of esports. It's barely even a competition. It's just a dumb knockabout that masquerading as esports. I cannot view this as anything other than self-serving garbage, and I have nothing nuanced to say about it whatsoever. But I had to shove it in here because there is an increasing number of these things, and they're all for the same top 10 games, and it's all a bit shite. I can't make a 30-minute video about that topic, unfortunately, because there's nothing interesting to say about them. They suck, they're self-indulgent, they serve a very select amount of the community, and people position this as the future of esports, generally because they're part of the select group of people who have something to gain from pushing this as the truth. So, got that one out of the way. I hope your takeaway from this video isn't that I think speedrunning tournaments, when they're actually tournaments, are inherently a terrible idea, because I don't think that. But what I do think is that I need to challenge the notion that money coming into the scene via tournaments is always a good thing, because I don't think that's true. There's no law of economics that says that has to be true, so I'm here to make that known, or whatever. I'd like to think if we as a community can actually sit down and think about what we want out of our tournament scene and what we would want it to look like, we can create something that's still somewhat in line with our community ethos. I don't really have a good idea of what that would look like at the moment. Maybe I can pursue that topic in a future video. There's a thought. But for the time being, I hope you found my musings on this topic interesting. If you would like to read more, again, you can read the articles that I wrote about this very topic a couple of years ago. They're in the description. Thank you very much for listening. If you enjoyed this video, by all means do the like, comment, subscribe thing that I am obliged to push. God. I do want to do more types of video content like this. I actually have like a bunch of scripts for this sort of thing written, and I have for a while. And whether or not it's actually worth my time to produce those videos rides on how well I think this sort of thing is received, you know? I don't really make YouTube content very often because it's a hell of a lot of effort, and you may notice the production videos on this particular thing are borderline non-existent. Because making high-quality videos takes more time and effort than I have to spare in a given day. I work a full-time job currently, you know. It's a hard life, being someone attempting to put too many fingers in too many pies at the same time. Anyway, thank you very much for listening. I'm gonna stop nagging your ear off now. Bye-bye.